and welcome back to the health series. Today's video is a highly requested topic. I've had a lot of questions about this, and so I decided I'd research a little bit and do a episode on it. But we're going to talk about today the menstrual cycle. I know, so exciting. I'm actually really excited about this topic, believe it or not, because as I researched it, I kind of discovered so much more about it than I thought, and realized, wow, I really don't know about what happens in my own body. So I'm pretty excited, but it's pretty much covering the menstrual cycle, what happens and how and why, and then the training around that whole cycle. Then the training around your cycle and how you can utilize the changes in your hormones to pretty much gain as much progress as you can. So I have done a few diagrams for this YouTube. I'm getting way too into it. So I have them here on a little clipboard. I'm sorry about my pen, but I have them here. We have the uterus, and we also have the period cycle, or the phases of the period. So I will refer to these, but I'm gonna put them up a little bit later and share them. Firstly, we're gonna talk about the layers of the uterus. So for those of you that don't know, your period happens in your uterus. Ha! Surprise, lesson number one if you didn't know that. So the uterus has 3 layers, and this is why I've done the diagram, because it's really helpful to see. So we have 3 layers. The innermost layer, which is obviously the innermost, is called the endometrium. This is the most important layer that we are going to discuss today, but I'm going to tell you about the other 2. Then you have the myometrium, which is pretty much muscle fibers in multiple different directions. And then you have the peritoneum, which is how it connects to all the organs around and is supported inside you. So we're going to talk about the endometrium. This first part is a lot about where does the blood come from? I don't know. Do you know? Well, I researched it because I was like, how does this even happen? What even goes on? Like, I know it happens, but how and why? So there's pretty much 2 layers in the endometrium. There's like so many scientific words, so I'm probably gonna get a bit confused, and I'm sorry if you get lost, but I'll try my hardest to keep it pretty basic. You have 2. There is called I'm gonna actually read this from my notes so I get it right. It's the stratum functionalis, which is the very first one, and then you have the stratum basalis. I think that's how you say them. I'm not sure. But those 2 layers are the most important in terms of what happens with your period. So for simplicity's sake, I'm gonna call the stratum functionalis, which is the innermost layer of the first layer, layer number one, and then the stratum basalis, which is the little next one next to it, is going to be layer number 2. So I'm just going to refer to them as number 1, number 2, so that it makes a bit more sense for you guys when you're actually learning about this. Just before you get your period, most people get like pre or PMS, sort of pre-MS is the symptoms related to getting your period, but all of these symptoms come along because just before your period, you actually get restriction in the oxygen supply to layer number 1 of the uterus. So basically, your blood vessels that supply this area start to constrict. The oxygen can no longer reach that area, and the cells in that layer start to die. That's what happens. So layer number 1 starts dying. White blood cells get flushed to the area because they're involved in the healing process and managing all of the cell death. I guess they're trying to get rid of it. So then once it all dies and starts to fall out, which is your period, or part of your period, that's the tissues you'd probably... This sounds so gross when I'm talking about it. I'm really sorry if any guys are like, ugh, or even any girls, but the tissue or parts that you get in your period, ladies, you know what I mean? That's the part that's actually dying. That's that layer there, layer number 1. So then your blood vessels that have been feeding that layer are now exposed, and that's where your blood actually comes from. Some of them are a little bit more exposed than others, and they're sort of starting to die off as well, the ends of them, but that's where the blood comes from. Once that starts to happen and the oxygen starts to die off or not be supplying that area, this is apparently where you get your cramping. So the fact that there's no actual oxygen supply to that layer of tissue signals to your body and it starts to cramp. That's PMS cramps. Apparently it's that. Pretty sure that's what it is anyway. And that lack of oxygen actually stimulates for layer number 2 to, this protein comes along, trying to keep this really simple, but the protein comes along and basically tells layer number 2, oh, you need to regenerate that tissue that we just lost. And that's when this rebuild starts to happen. So that protein that comes along and rebuilds the layer number 1 that started to shed, that's basically indicating how long your period actually happens. So if you stimulate a lot of that protein, you're gonna have a pretty short period. So anyone that's lucky enough to have like a 1 or 2 day period is like, woo, you have a lot of that protein. If you don't have a lot of that protein, or it doesn't get produced as much or released into that tissue as much, that's when you get a longer period, and it's lasting a lot longer, because as the tissue regenerates, that's where the blood supply starts to get fed back into tissues, because it's regenerating, it's no longer exposed, and then the bleeding stops. One thing I really wanted to cover was, I didn't really know this for a really long time when I was probably early 20s. But day 1 of your cycle is the first day you actually show blood. I was like, always thought that day 1 was the last, like the first day of your non-bleeding days, and I always counted it that way and never ever felt like it was regular. So day 1 is actually day 1 of your bleeding, and it goes for 28 days, around about, give or take a couple. Some people experience a longer period, up to 32, 33, 34 days. Some are even longer and some are even less. So that's up to, well, that's pretty much varies between people, but it's around that 28 day mark is a general number for the length of a period cycle. So now we're going to go into the actual cycle and what actually happens there. So day 1 to day 14 is the first half, and then day 14 to day 28 is your second half. So we're going to look at this little graph here that I printed. I made one of the boys at the gym print this, so they were like, why do you need a uterus? That's weird. So this is your cycle. I want to show you this. So you can see this side here, you got day 1 to 14. That's actually wrong. This side is day 1 to 14, and then you have day 14 to day 28. In this middle period here, which is around day 14, is where you are fertile, and it's called your ovulation day. So this is where, if you're doing the birds and the bees chat, you're gonna fall pregnant. Well, hopefully that's the general idea, is where this is where your eggs ready for fertility, and if it happens, creates a baby. Day 1 to day 14, let's talk about this. This phase is called the follicular phase. So basically, the first part of your period. I'm just going to swap this over so you can I can see it better. And this is the phase where estrogen is high. The purpose of this phase is to grow back the endometrial layer, number 1, the layer number 1. So the purpose of it is growing that back and preparing the cell or the wall for being a really, really nourishing and rich environment that can actually help with fertility. So it's making it like sperm friendly. So around day 14 is where you ovulate. So this is where your egg is starting to be released. And this period here is where you start changing from phase 1 to phase 2, which is your luteal phase. That's phase number 2. And this area here is where it's pretty much getting ready for fertility and having this baby grow inside the uterus. So follicular phase, phase 1, day 1 to day 14, is really, really dominant in estrogen. Your estrogen levels increase, and they pretty much increase all the way until just before you ovulate, which is around your day 14, where it's at its peak. And then progesterone comes along, huge surge in progesterone. Estrogen is now declining, you've ovulated, and you start going into phase number 2. Phase number 2 is your luteal phase, and that is about increasing progesterone, having your estrogen a little bit lower, so your progesterone is now coming up, and it pretty much goes all the way up until you get back to day 28, where if you haven't fertilized your egg, these hormone levels can't be maintained or don't need to be maintained, so the progesterone starts to drop, estrogen comes back up, and you get your period. So that's your 28-day cycle. give or take a couple of days, depending on what your cycle is like. Phase 1 is about rebuilding the lining and making it sperm friendly, and phase number 2 is about building the endometrium layer ready for fertilization, so that if an egg is fertilized, it'll get implanted in the wall and it can grow your baby. The follicular phase. Some bad news, but your metabolic rate is actually low here. So naturally, you have a lower metabolic rate, you have increased levels of estrogen, but you have increased insulin sensitivity, which means that you are better able to use carbohydrates as your body's fuel or when you exercise. So that's sort of a really important point when you're looking at the fact that you've got a really low metabolic rate. You can actually combat that metabolic rate or help prevent it from actually causing any issues by having carbohydrate dense foods and really high intensity training. Phase 1 is optimal for high intensity workouts where you're pretty much smashing yourself. You have a really high pain tolerance during this time, and you can refeed after those workouts with carbohydrate rich foods. So your sweet potatoes, your rices, all of those sort of post-workout meals can be really rich in carbohydrates to help combat the fact that your metabolic rate is lower. If you don't know what metabolic rate is and you're starting to get lost, it's pretty much how much energy your body uses to function. So it's dropped down during this time, but you can help obviously combat that with your workout and your diet. Moral of the story, train hard, eat carbs. As you get closer to your ovulation phase, which is where your estrogen is at its peak, during this time, the estrogen is high, progesterone comes along, like I said earlier, takes over, and an increased surge of progesterone is going to cause a natural drop in your serotonin levels. Serotonin is your feel-good hormone. So if you are craving carbohydrates at this time, it is because your body will naturally increase its serotonin levels when you eat carbs. So your body goes, oh, I really feel like carbs, because it's going to make it increase, like naturally, your serotonin levels, which have just dropped. So now that you know it's because of your hormone cycle, it's a little bit easier to kind of, I guess, avoid, but it's still hard. So progesterone has increased, and now your hormone levels for your phase 2 have changed. So you've got really high progesterone, not so much estrogen anymore, or it's not as dominant. And this time of your phase, you have a high metabolic rate, which is like, woo, winning, but your insulin sensitivity is now low. Also, a little bit of a downer is the fact that your body temperature is now high during your luteal phase, which means you're probably gonna feel a little bit hotter than normal, you might sweat more, your core temperature is up. So this phase here is not so optimal for higher intensity work because one, you can't use carbohydrates as well, and you're probably better off, well, you're in a better fat burning mode. So you're using fat as fuel a lot better. So you want a lower to like a moderate intensity workouts here, much more like longer phase endurance training, not so intense because your pain tolerance isn't as high. You have a high metabolic rate already, so that means you don't really need to smash yourself in the gym and try and manipulate that. And you obviously can't use carbohydrates well, so if you're going to eat those carbohydrates after your high intensity workout in your luteal phase, it's not going to actually do as well as what it would in your first phase. So you're at training a little bit lower in the moderate intensity, and you're eating a lot more fats and cutting out your carbs a little bit, like don't cut them out, but not eating as many as you would as phase 1. So the moral of the story with the luteal phase is lower intensity training, more aerobic endurance type work. So a little bit more higher reps if you're doing weights training, not so intense and not so strength based, and eat more fats and eat less carbohydrates and drop your calories down just a little bit lower, and that will help stimulate a fat burning zone. Now, I also want to talk about PMS symptoms because that is a huge problem for a lot of girls. There's this amino acid called tryptophan, which is basically the reason why you're like, it's gonna be it's a precursor for serotonin. So it creates this other pretty much protein which creates serotonin, and if you're not getting enough of this tryptophan, then you're gonna have all these PMSing, like moody symptoms. So basically you can actually either buy it as a supplement, or you can eat foods which are rich in tryptophan. Some of those foods would be turkey, you got lean turkey, soybeans, skim milk, and there was one other, and it was pumpkin seeds. P.S. pumpkin seeds are a miracle, so eat more of those. I'll talk about them in a different video. But if you're experiencing PMS, getting those foods around the luteal phase would actually help. in a natural way. Otherwise, you can go and get a supplement for it, but maybe talk to your GP about all that stuff if it's actually such a problem anyway. And as you get back towards your day 28 and you're getting towards your period, which is called menses, super fancy, you want to start building back to those high intensity workouts as you start getting them. So in your couple of like that luteal phase, you're probably going to start experiencing fluid retention. So things to help that is like reducing your salt intake and making sure you're drinking enough water. Also movement and not super high intensity movement is going to help with that as well. But it's also probably going to be really uncomfortable for you to be doing these high intensity workouts anyway. So because of all of that fluid retention that's going on anyway. So once you start getting towards that menses day or getting your period for the day one, that's when you can start thinking about, okay, when it comes along, I'm going to start working on my higher intensity workouts as I get back into the gym during day 1 to day 14. And obviously alongside a higher carbohydrate diet and increasing those calories back up. I have not touched on the importance of the ovulation phase just yet, because it's probably my favorite part. Ovulation, around your day 14. This is where you have really good opportunities for strength. If you're going to go for a 1RM PR type thing, this is probably the most optimal time you will be able to achieve that, or you'll get really good results, because obviously you've got this whole increased carbohydrate intake, you've stored all your glycogen, and then it's a really good environment for you to start lifting heavy. However, you are also more at risk of injury here, because there is a lot to do with collagen and estrogen levels. So basically that changes your tissues. They become a little bit more lax, which is like stretchy. And you become at risk of developing an injury. So if you are doing this 1RM, PRing, whatever you want to call it, at your ovulation phase, be careful with technique and form, and take it easy with your rest and recovery. Make sure that you're actually doing it properly, because there was a study that said that you are 4 times more likely to tear your ACL, which is in your knee, doing heavier lifts due to the fact that you are in that ovulation period. So if you want to do strength training or lift heavy, do it then. However, be careful with technique and form. So that's pretty much the basics, well, as close to the basics as I could keep, with giving you enough information about the menstrual cycle, how it works and how you train. But I would like to just really recap quickly with my graph. I hope you can still see this. Your day 1 to day 14 is your follicular phase. You have higher estrogen. Oh, I wrote my arrow wrong. Reduced metabolism, and you also have an increased sensitivity to insulin. So eat carbs, train hard, and you should be pretty sweet there. Ovulation phase is around day 14, give or take a couple of days. That's where you do your strength training there. Make sure your warm-ups are high, or long, like good. Your recovery phase is good as well, and make sure that you're really focusing on form and technique. And if you really want to take a collagen supplement, that's going to be optimal there. Then you have your luteal phase, other side, day 14 to day 28. This is where your estrogen levels are now a bit lower, your increased progesterone, you have a high body temperature. You're also going to be feeling a little bit moody because your serotonin levels aren't as high, so that's why you're craving carbohydrates. But because your insulin sensitivity isn't that great, try not to eat the carbs because you're not going to use them that well. Think about a fat-driven diet or a higher fat diet, and you want to drop down to a moderate paced intensity workout. Often, more than not, it's better to do endurance training, and as you get closer to day 28, that's when you can start thinking about starting to bring, well, after day 28, you're going to start bringing in your higher intensity workouts back then. That's pretty much it in terms of the period that I kind of wanted to talk about, or that I thought would help. I hope you liked it, and I hope it was really helpful. I actually learned a little bit more than I expected when I did some research before I actually made this video. I knew a lot about it, but not that much. And I'm super excited to share this with you, because I really feel like lots of women don't really know what goes on with their period and why they feel so crap, or why they don't feel so great with their training. So if you get anything out of this, please let me know. If you need to change your programming, have a crack at that. If you need some help with that, let me know as well. But otherwise, please subscribe to my channel, because I really want to reach out to so many people. Share this video if you think it's helpful, like it, Follow my Instagram and my Facebook, whatever, you know the drill. And I look forward to seeing you guys in the next video. Thanks for watching. Bye.